In his book Posthumanist Applied Linguistics, Alistair Pennycook refers to the limits of anthropocentrism as the inability to think otherwise. Instead, he says, we should rethink the already thought. One such area where posthumanists see a need for novel ways of critical thinking is language, which they diagnose as suffering from a toxic anthropocentric approach. Inspired by Pennycook's recent work and wary of the imminent dangers of the so-called Anthropocene, the Dutch linguist Leonie Cornelips has heralded the animal turn in sociolinguistics and called for putting animals on the linguistic research agenda. At the same time, researchers interested in interstellar communication are also calling for a more expanded account of language, claiming that extraterrestrials have language and languages. A recent book by Daniel Oberhaus, entitled Extraterrestrial Languages, attests to the common acceptance of such a belief among the members of the exolinguistic community. Thinking about language in non-anthropocentric terms, it would seem, will help humans understand better what it means to be human. Expanding the notion of language is either understood as another way of saying that all beings communicate, or as implying that non-human animals and extraterrestrials have their own language and languages. In both cases, there is a push towards recognizing language and communication as species-neutral terms, thus emphasizing continuity instead of discontinuity. So the question we need to ask ourselves is, what is language? If you opt for a more inclusive linguistics, as Pennycook and Cornelips do, you will take the position that language is not restricted to how humans use the term. The word language doesn't only need to be broadened semantically, it needs to be radically redefined. We have, that is, been wrong about language all along. In an age critical to anthropocentrism and from a posthumanist point of view, it is inconsequential whether human beings recognize other creatures as having language or not. We only have our limited human view and thus are unfit to act as the ultimate authorities on that matter. An anthropocentric approach to language doesn't necessarily have to embrace the scientism that has been the hallmark of 20th century linguistics. Rather, it could be argued that language belongs to humankind, not as an object of study for metaphysics masquerading as science, but because human beings experience language in their first-order activities. Linguistic experience is a human universal. To be sure, language is not only a first-order reality, but also a second-order concept, i.e. we treat it as if there was a scientific definition of language, but there isn't. We reflect on language and discuss it with others, all the while experiencing its reality on a continuous basis. We each experience language individually and hence uniquely, but it belongs to us all. By saying this, one is not imposing some Western anthropocentric version of language upon non-Western conceptions. Also, it is not simply a matter of whether every human culture can muster an equivalent linguistic term for language, a macrosocial constraint. Still, I have to assume that human beings all possess linguistic experience, however varied that experience undoubtedly is. That is, every human being has a personal communicational history, of which linguistic experience is an integral part. This is what I have in common with all other human beings, past, present, and future. On that very basis, one could indeed be advocating for an anthropocentric approach to language, which is not the same as setting limits to what language can be, anthropologically speaking, within the human communicational universe. The human world would be radically different without language. In fact, we cannot even begin to fathom what the human world would be like if, as a species, we lacked language. The scholarly consensus seems to be that human communication, as Pennycook puts it, originated in the nonverbal communication of our closest relatives. Entertaining such a hypothesis, it is needless to say, only makes sense once you have externalized and objectified, in the name of science, what is actually a highly personal and continuous phenomenon. The linguist Roy Harris developed the notion of the supercategory, which may help us understand the problems involved in a non-anthropocentric approach to language. According to Harris, supercategories concern long-established disciplinary formations, usually with prestigious professions attached to them, both within and outside academia, like natural science, social science, law, politics, history, philosophy, art, and religion. For Harris, the various supercategories stand on a par with each other, in that it is hard to explain what, say, science is in its current state without implicitly or explicitly contrasting it with religion or comparing it with the humanities. Supercategories are, according to Harris, verbal constructs, and thus they are language dependent. In fact, every supercategory develops its own discourse and specialized language within which it defines its own terms. The basic function of a supercategory, according to Harris, is to integrate what would otherwise be separate activities and inquiries. For example, calling oneself a scientist only makes sense because others call themselves scientists. These other scientists are believed to adhere to the same standards and norms as I do. Moreover, science is perceived by its practitioners and by the public as having a continuous existence. One's activities make sense because others did engage, are engaging, and will engage in similar activities. Observing the stars by itself does not constitute science, just as drawing something on paper does not constitute art, or reflecting on the meaning of life does not constitute philosophy. It is the activities of observing the stars, producing a drawing, or reflecting on life as macro-socially embedded activities, which makes them what they are, activities engaged in against the background of some kind of institutionalization. Activities done under the aegis of a supercategory thus require a sense of historicity on the part of those who interpret a particular activity as, say, scientific. The issue here is that when viewed from the point of view of a hypothetical Martian, the latter would not be able to tell by pure observation, if observing is among the Martian activities, what makes or fails to make human activities particular activities of this or that kind. For example, the observing Martian might be confused why only some arguments are credited by the media with the science label, while others are not. In other words, you need an insider, i.e. human perspective, to be able to appreciate how various activities are integrated on various levels in often complex ways, which for instance allows you to understand how labeling activities relate to other human activities. It is a matter of growing up in a human community as a human being, and of acquiring a personal communicational history as a human being. It is also a matter of having language. So even if the Martian had acquired fluency in the English language, the question remains whether our Martian, being able to label supercategorical activities, could be credited with knowing what makes a supercategory. Being, say, a scientist, artist, or philosopher requires awareness that there is a language of science, a language of art, and a language of philosophy, in which certain kinds of questions are raised and certain kinds of answers are provided. Being a scientist, artist, philosopher also requires that one entertains certain linguistic beliefs, a particular view about how language relates to the non-linguistic world. For example, what would be left of history without some acknowledgement that there were real people engaging in specific activities in real places at specific points in time in the past? Beliefs about how language relates to whatever goes on outside of it are human beliefs. On that view, there are no animal or Martian philosophies of language. Other questions, in fact, arise in connection with language, namely the question what counts as linguistic and what doesn't. The issue of writing and literacy are cases in point. Do the Martians possess the biomechanical capacity to hold a book and turn its pages? Does their eyesight allow them to identify any differences between the various human letters? The barrier between humans and extraterrestrials is not just literacy as a learnable skill, but as a cultural practice. In other words, unlike humans, no extraterrestrial, or chimpanzee for that matter, is born into a community in which their peers already possess and practice literacy. Can non-humans receive a crash course in human history, or does one need to have been born human in order to benefit from any such course? The thesis that animals and extraterrestrials have language is therefore a result of anthropomorphic thinking coupled with the dehumanization of human beings and the humanization of non-humans.